then we can turn over to Ralph. I don't know if...
All right, thank you. All right, let me go ahead and I will try to be as efficient as possible. I mainly want to talk this evening about this new series of programs that I watched featuring David Lipton. And of course, he's a famous guy. He's the one who wrote the book, what's the name of it again, Jim? Lipton's book, Body of Evidence, something like that. He was the first.
Best evidence.
Sorry. So he put forward the idea that is widely accepted today that JFK's body was altered before the autopsy, the so-called pre-autopsy, in which they basically, fixed the back of his head so that the big gouge of blast from the bullet that entered from the front was no longer visible, etc. And that was some good work. But at this point in time, he's trying to advocate a new theory that Oswald didn't die because of the catastrophic gunshot trauma, but rather because a doctor in the operating room at Parkland deliberately introduced an air bubble into his IV to kill him because he was in league with the plotter. So that's what he's claiming. Now, it's interesting that in the show that I watched, which was called Night Fright, that they asked him, well, which doctor was it? And he says, well, I could tell you, but I'm not going to. Not now. You're going to have to read my book. I'm going to put it in my book that he's coming out with.
Ralph, that's Final Charade.
Final Charade is the name of the book. Okay.
Yeah, I have some serious reservations about that Night Fright show.
All right. Well, I've got serious reservations about this whole story, and the gist of it is that what he bases this claim on, and let me say again before we go any further that what bothers me about all this is the fact that a lot of people will paint conspiracy advocates like us with a broad brush, and so when something like this comes along, which seems preposterous and is preposterous, well then I think it can affect all of us, and that's why I feel an obligation to quickly renounce it. But what it's based on is just one thing, that according to Lifton, that after Oswald died and after Ruby died, and let me just say that I've got a lot of questions about Ruby's death because he was condemned, to death. He was found guilty at his trial of killing Oswald and given the death sentence, which really seems unusual under the circuit when you consider whom he killed. But it was after that, quite a while after that, that his lawyers finally won him a new trial on some grounds. I don't know what the legal grounds were, but they did win him the right to a new trial. And it was shortly after that he came down with cancer and then quickly, died. And it seems rather strange to me that would happen. And it seems to me like it must have been imperative to the powers that be that he not have a new trial because of what could come out at that trial. So that's one thing that gives me pause. Another thing that gives me pause that we really should mention is that, about Dorothy Kilgallen, the fact that she died under very mysterious circumstances. And there's a new book, and perhaps you know the name of this book as well, Jim, that's just coming out now about Dorothy Kilgallen and how she may have been killed because of her involvement in investigating the JFK assassination. But do you know what she did shortly before she died? The last thing she did?
Yeah, she
interviewed Jack Ruby.
Jack Ruby. Now,
and she said she was going to blow the case wide open.
And we never found out. Her notes disappeared.
That's right.
They never found out. But I'm thinking to myself, she was a very bright woman. She's interviewing Jack Ruby. She's hearing him talking about the assassination, and two things I think probably occurred to her. One was that this guy was not right in his mind. He couldn't stay on point. He was constantly drifting. Couldn't answer a question without going off on a tangent. And sometimes he wouldn't answer the question at all. He would just say what he wanted to say. But whenever he spoke about his killing of Oswald, he always spoke about it in the third person. Like he'd say something like, yeah, and that's when it happened. he would never speak in the first person of "that's when I shot Oswald." And she may have picked up on that, and at some point she may have asked him that, well, what can you tell me about, your shooting Oswald? And that's when he probably told her, as he told others, well, it was all a blur. It was all a blur. That he remembered going down the ramp, passing the officer in the ramp, whose name was Rio Pierce, and his nickname was Sam Pierce. You would think that Rio was the nickname, but no, Rio was the name and Sam was the nickname. So he passes Sam Pierce, and there's no doubt that Sam was there. That was acknowledged. And obviously he was close enough to identify him. And if he was close enough to identify Sam as he walked by him, and he never said he snuck by him. It's not as though he was crawling on the ground by him. So if he saw Sam, Sam had to see him. Sam let him get into that garage. Okay.
Ralph, I hope you're not suggesting Dorothy Kilgallen was killed because she realized that Lee Oswald wasn't shot by Jack Ruby.
No, I'm not going to say that. No, I wouldn't go.
Because Dorothy, having an exclusive interview with Jack Ruby, knew enough. Jack was telling the reporters that if someone else had been vice president, this would never have happened. If Adlai Stevenson had been vice president, our beloved President Kennedy would not be dead. I mean, she had plenty to work with without having figured out that Jack didn't shoot Lee.
Well, all I'm suggesting is that she just figured out that something wasn't right with Jack Ruby, and that just vaguely something wasn't right about the whole story. Because
Jim, I'm sorry, wouldn't it be possible that Ruby told Dorothy, what really happened?
Well, the only thing that Jack Ruby ever said is that he remembered going to the garage, and then he remembered being pounced on by police, and then asking them, "Why are you doing this? This is me, Jack Ruby. You know me." Now, if he knew he had shot Oswald, he'd have known why they were pouncing on him, but he didn't know that they were doing that. And then they dragged him off. But anyway, here's the thing. Remember something. Regardless of what he actually told her and what she thought, the fact is that if he spent hours talking to Dorothy Kilgallen, the plotters, what could they have known? I mean, they for all they knew, Jack Ruby, she may have figured out that Jack Ruby didn't do it. I mean, in other words, I'm saying that the imperative to get her killed, to get her dead, may have involved the idea that she uncovered more about Ruby and what happened and didn't happen than they were.
She uncovered more about Lyndon Johnson, Ralph. This thing about Ruby is so obscure that I guarantee it didn't come up at that point. That's my opinion.
Okay. All right. But anyway, so anyway, getting back to Lifton then, the basis of his claim that a doctor killed Oswald is that...
Before we go there, I really believe that she was killed because of her interview with Jack Ruby. Now, as far as figuring out what the shenanigans in the Dallas Police Department, I don't go there.
Consider this: if this wasn't a factor in why she was killed, why did they steal her notes? Why weren't they found in her room?
Because they were loaded with stuff about LBJ, Ralph.
Wait a second. You're saying that Jack Ruby was telling her stuff about LBJ?
Well, he was even telling the reporters, for Christ's sake, Ralph.
He was.
All right. But
well, I don't think these two are mutually exclusive. I think
Yeah, but I think it's a stretch. About as far as shooting, maybe. But I would be dumbfounded. I could be wrong. I think she had more than enough to justify her being killed by the bad guys.
Well, that's true, but I mean, if you throw this Ruby didn't shoot Oswald into the mix, that really heats things up in a hurry.
Bringing up LBJ, Don. Jesus.
Yeah, that'll do it too. Yeah.
Well, just look at it this way.
That'll do it too.
Since they weren't present at her interview with Ruby, she did this alone. She was the only journalist who had a private interview with Jack Ruby.
Right, we know.
What he said, and how could they take a chance? Maybe their fear was that maybe something gave out to give this very bright woman a clue that perhaps there was something else going on. So I think that it may have added to the...
I was more interested in hearing your critique of David Lifton. Listen, Ralph, you have to read Best Evidence, one of the most brilliant books ever published on JFK.
All right, very good. All right, let me go on then. Okay. So anyway, Ruby wins a new trial. He's gonna be given a whole new trial, and then all of a sudden he's got this cancer. It's severe, and within weeks he's dead. And it was after that. In fact, it was years after that, according to Lifton, that Ruby's lawyers, who were still, I guess, wrapping things up for him, produced a Texas pathologist who was not involved in the case, not at Parkland, who had no direct connection to it, but based on, I don't know, I guess on some basis, this pathologist claimed that he believed that the doctors in the operating room at Parkland killed Oswald. Okay.
Yeah,
On the
be sure to mute your mics if you're not talking.
If I'm called for this other show, I'll have to take off, but I'll keep monitoring and end this one when you call it, Gary.
Okay.
All right, very good. All right. So now he did give the name of this doctor. I don't recall his name. But what I did do after watching the program was just do a search online to see if I could find out anything about a Texas pathologist from somewhere in the Houston area, I recall that, saying that Oswald was killed by the doctors at Parkland. Because I figured that if he said it, everything's on the internet today, and if Ruby's lawyers were spouting it, that sure enough it would have to be online somewhere. But I couldn't find it in reference to anything, not even when I put in David Lifton in connection to it.
Well, remember, Chuck Crenshaw was in charge of Lee Oswald's treatment, and Chuck Crenshaw most assuredly did not kill him.
Okay. But anyway, what I want to do is I want to talk about everything that happened in that operating room, and I specifically want to talk about the 5 doctors who were involved in operating on Oswald. I've got just a very short bio on each one of them because I want you to understand who they were. But before we do that, this is a collage here that I just want to throw out very quickly. It was sent to me by the guy that we call the Wizard, who we don't want to name. But this is, on the left is Jack Ruby. It's a very large close-up image of the back of his head from the midnight press conference on Friday night. Oh, by the way, this may interest you, and maybe you already know it, but according to Chief Curry, that at the midnight press conference, Jack Ruby went up to him and told him that he was there representing the Jewish press.
Yes.
Did you know that?
Yes.
You guys know that? Okay.
Yes.
But anyway, if you look at the back of his head, Ruby's, you can see how irregular his hairline was, how sloppy and jagged it was. And you can also see how dark the skin on the back of his neck was. And that darkness is actually what I call the scruffy hair growth that he was getting, because it apparently had been several weeks since he got a haircut, and so the hair was growing in, and it grew all the way down to his collar line and below it. And that's why it looks so dark. In some of the other images, you can see the hair.
Yeah, and Ruby was Jewish too, so he wasn't a white guy. That's another.
Well, no, he was Jewish, and he was very, very deeply involved in the Jewish faith. He had a Jewish yarmulke on him at the time of his arrest, and they included it in his belongings in the police invoice. So yes, he was in. He had attended the temple, the synagogue, that Saturday, the night before. He was very involved in practicing the Jewish faith. But anyway, on the right, of course, we have the garage shooter, and you see how clean his neck was. It was very finely razored. He had obviously had his hair cut recently. And I want to point out to you that this long hair that's curled up on the bottom that we see on the garage shooter with a very straight hairline, I'm sure that that was fake. There is absolutely no reason to think that either Ruby or Bookhout had hair that was that long. In fact, nobody at that time, this was pre-Beatles, by the way, nobody had hair that long in back. It just wasn't being worn. And the only question I have is how they did this. Was this a wig that Bookhout was wearing? And it may have been. Or was it a photographic alteration that they did, which they could have done to just make the hair look longer? And they may have done that frame by frame, and I don't know. It could have been one or it could have been the other. But in either case, I want to point out that the hair is very different. You don't, on Ruby, you don't have the straight hairline going across. And on Bookhout on the right, you don't have the scruffy hair growth. He had a very clean hairline in back with light skin. And I might also add that Ruby had a longer, thinner neck. Bookhout had a shorter, stubbier, wider neck. And there's really nothing but contrast between these two necks. Now, why do we keep comparing the neck and the back of the head? Well, it's because that's all they gave us. They wouldn't show us the face of the shooter. If we had his face, we could compare his face to Ruby's, but we don't have it. They only show us him from the back, and so we have to compare him to Ruby from the back, and it could not be more divergent than it is. This alone makes certain that Jack Ruby was not the garage shooter. Okay, go to the next. Slide.
That guy on the right there is a white guy. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. All right, go to the next one. This is also from. This is from the Wizard. He sent me this large up photo. That's Oswald's hand on the left. It's his left hand. It's supposed to be his left hand in the Jackson photo on the right. And what he was pointing out to me, the Wizard, is if you compare the size of the thumbs, you can see that Oswald had a relatively small thumb, whereas that thumb on the right, which is from the Jackson photo, is a humongous thumb, and it is much, much larger, a much bigger nail. And there's simply no way that Oswald's hand could have been photographed like that. So there's absolutely no doubt that the Robert Jackson photo of the Oswald shooting is an altered photo. It is a manipulated photo. It's one of the most famous news photos of all time. It won the Pulitzer Prize, but it is a grotesquely altered photo, and this is just one of them. If you count the fingers on that hand on the right side, he's got a total of 4 fingers. He's got 3 fingers on the left and then the 1 thumb. And the whole contour of the wrist leading up to the thumb is anatomically impossible. That is a grotesque monster image of a hand, and there's no way that it is legitimate, which proves that, you know, whatever story that photo is supposed to be telling can't be true, since the photo isn't real. Okay, go to the next. All right, this is some very recent work, also by the Wizard. I want to discuss this a second. He had a brilliant idea. This is a photo of Jack Ruby standing next to Boyd, Detective Elmer Boyd was his name, and he did a lot of escorting that day. You know, we have pictures of him escorting Oswald. We have pictures of him escorting Ruby. So this is him escorting Ruby. And what he wants you to observe is basically how high Jack Ruby went on Elmer Boyd. And roughly speaking, I would say that basically Ruby went up to about his eyes. That's basically how I would describe that. That's Elmer was a tall guy, well over 6 feet tall. We know that Jack Ruby was 5'8", so he went up to about the level of his eyes. Okay, so go to the next photo. Okay, now this again, this is the handiwork of the Wizard. He made this. He made the one photo rather faint, and the photo that's faint is the one of the Ruby imposter taken at the PD, the one that we discovered in the memorial film that was made about the killing of Oswald 30 years later. But if you look at the guy in the white hat that's looming large at us faintly, that's Elmer Boyd. So what I'm saying that those are both the same guy. That guy and then the man who's standing there. And the man who's standing there was imposed into the picture by the Wizard. It's the same guy. That's Elmer Boyd 30 years later. And he was standing there. It was part of the retrospective. He's not wearing a hat, and he's 30 years older. but that is the same guy. Now, the reason why he put him there is because he's standing there. And in the other photo, he's actually sitting or he's leaning forward. He's not standing up straight. All right. So what the wizard wants you to observe here is how tall the Ruby imposter, who I maintain was Bookhout, was compared to Boyd. And from what I'm seeing, he's a little bit shorter. That his the top of his head is parallel with probably about, maybe the bridge of his nose or a little bit lower. So in other words, he is shorter next to Boyd than what we saw of Ruby next to Boyd. And by the wizard's estimation, that if Ruby was 5'8", then this would make this guy 5'6". And we've reached that conclusion about Bookhout previously by other means. So this is a confirmation that that James Bookhout was about 5'6", and I consider it to be very good work by the wizard. Okay, go on to the next image, please. All right, now I brought this just as kind of for fun. Go to the next image.
It should be downloaded.
Okay, here you go.
This was kind of big. It'll be here in a second. Okay.
All right, so what we have here is a collage of Johnny Carson. I actually met Johnny Carson. I went to his house once, but that's Johnny Carson on the left. And the reason I chose that picture of Johnny Carson on the left is because I think it's probably comparable in age to the picture we have of Bookhout in high school. We have this picture of Bookhout as an ROTC cadet in high school, probably about the same age that Johnny Carson was here on the left. And we can compare that image to the image of Bookhout in the police department with the detectives. So the age is about right. And since Bookhout was about 50, I grabbed a picture of Johnny Carson when he was also about 50. So basically, and we're going to look at the, but what I want you to notice here is that obviously it is the same person. There are no disconnects. You really get the sense that this is Johnny Carson over several decades of time, from being being a teenage boy to being a middle-aged man. However, if I had just shown you the image of the young Johnny Carson without the other and asked you to guess who he is, you might have gotten it. If you were clever, you might have figured out that's a young Johnny Carson, but you probably would have had to think about it a while. And it does take a little bit of study to actually get to realize that it's Johnny Carson, but that is him, and it of course it's a very good preservation of likeness. And let me point out that not everybody keeps their identity that consistent throughout life. There are plenty of people. In fact, I was just looking today. I could have brought it with me, but I was just looking today at the picture of a cousin of mine. In which, as I look at him, he kind of doesn't look anything like he did. I mean, when he was a boy. I mean, I don't really, pick up any, clear-cut identification that, this is the same guy that I knew when, he was just a kid. So some people change a lot, and some people kind of keep their look, and Johnny kept his look, still had notice that even on the right, he still had kind of a boyish look to his face. So that's one reason why you might think that he really kind of kept his look. All right, let's go to the next one, which is the one of Bookhout. So anyway, yeah, go to the next one. All right, so here we have James Bookhout, and this was from high school. Now, if you look closely on the left, I actually put a little splotch over the side of his nose there because I firmly believe that they artificially tried to widen his nose. They didn't bother trying to widen the other side, which still looks very narrow. He had a very narrow nose, but they widened just one side of it. So I tried to get rid of that by putting just a little kind of a dab of whiteout right over that extra piece. But I would say that this likeness is every bit as good as the likeness that Carson had. If you look at the size of the eyes and the spacing of the eyes, if you look at the size of the mouth and the width of the mouth and the relative size of the lips, if you look at the whole shape of the face, if you look at the size and the shape of the chin, all of these things match very, very well. This is a better than average preservation of look for a guy going from, say, 16 to 50. It's better than, just as Johnny Carson's was better than average, I think this one is better than average. And I consider this very strong evidence that is Bookhout on both sides of the screen. Let's go to the next image now. Now this next one is a GIF, and I don't know if it's going to operate as a GIF here in this program, but let's see if it does. Let's see if this does. It should make a transformation by itself. Oh, I guess it's not going to do it. But anyway,
make it smaller.
If you open it in a browser, it'll.
Yeah, I can do it like this. Can I?
Yeah, put it in the browser, and you'll see it.
Open it in Chrome if you.
Open it in Chrome.
Yeah, Chrome or Safari. It'll.
Wait, let me see something.
So if you go to 2, on a PC, you right click on it. Well, I guess you can right click on a Mac now.
You know the.
Let me see. You mean this is a GIF right here. Okay, open it like that.
You probably gonna have to right click on it, or you find a way to open it with.
Open in dashboard.
All right. Well, we can just go on now.
Try to download it one more time.
We'll get it next time.
Okay.
All right, go to the next one then. All right, now I'm going to start talking about these doctors who operated on Oswald. But
okay, I'm going to be back in just 1 minute. Keep going.
So this was the lead surgeon who operated on Oswald, and this was him at the press conference that he gave immediately after Oswald died. He left the operating room at 1:07, and he went out and made a statement and talked to the reporters, and he answered questions. His name was Dr. Tom Shires was his name, and I want to talk about him. But before I do that, let me just briefly just describe what happened to Oswald. You know, one of the things I've been thinking about today is that, we talk about Oswald being shot and the fact that he had a wound. And I think about the word wound, and it's a very soft word. A wound is like, you can hurt your arm and have a wound on it. And you don't really think of wound as in itself being a life-threatening thing. Now, as far as I'm concerned, the only correct way to use the word wound in reference to Oswald is to say that he had a wound in his rib cage where the bullet went in. You could describe that as a wound, the entrance wound that you see. But what he actually had wasn't a wound. What he had was a catastrophic trauma. Okay.
Yeah, he had a fatal gunshot.
Oswald was in a state of absolute shock, and you might say biological terror inside of his body, because that bullet entered him and it went through his spleen, his pancreas, it blasted through his abdominal aorta, which is the biggest artery in the body. It blasted through his vena cava, the inferior vena cava, which is the largest vein in the body. It blasted through his superior mesenteric artery, which is also one of the largest arteries in the body. And then it blasted through his right kidney, which is very vascular. It's full of, vascular channels that bleed. And then it blasted through his liver, and then it's settled under the skin on the right side of his rib cage. Well, basically what happened to Oswald instantly is that, his heart initially kept beating, and since those blood vessels were open, it meant that it was just pumping the blood out into the space of his abdominal cavity. It was just literally squirting like a fountain out of his body. And it took very little time for basically his entire circulatory system to be empty, where he had practically no blood at all. Now, when he got into that operating room, what they found was that he had zero blood pressure, not low blood pressure, but no blood pressure at all. They found that his heart was still beating a little, but just sort of quivering, not effectively, pumping.
Yeah, they tried putting a pacemaker on it.
Well, they did put a pacemaker on
Yeah.
it. But the first thing they did was, they started pumping him full of blood, blood transfusions. And they gave him much more blood than the total amount of blood that was in his body. And the reason they had to do that was because as they kept putting the blood in, keep pumping out.
Yep.
And so they had to just keep pouring it in. And as they were doing that, though, the first thing they did was to try to repair those broken vessels. Those vessels are large enough, the aorta and the vena cava, can actually kind of sew them back together. They can actually take some thread and you can sew them back together. You can't do that with tiny vessels. With tiny vessels, all you can do is cauterize them, where you burn the end so that it stops leaking. So they started sewing the big vessels back together, and they started cauterizing, little vessels. But, they could only cauterize the vessels they could see. There were plenty of tiny vessels that they couldn't see. So there was no way they were going to completely restore the integrity of the circulatory system. But they were trying to mostly restore it, and then, keep filling it up with blood so that hopefully they could keep his circulatory system, full of blood. But when you think about the damage to his organs, and when you think about the catastrophic blood loss, basically Oswald was, not only was he hovering near death, but according to Dr. Malcolm Perry, who was one of the doctors there, and you know who Perry was, right? Perry is the guy who said that the wound in Kennedy's neck looked to him like the entrance wound of a small caliber bullet. And he took a lot of flack from that. Did you read his testimony to the Warren Commission, where Arlen Specter really browbeat him to try to say that, look, are you really sure it was an entrance wound? Don't you think it's possible that it was an exit wound? He really just,
Go ahead, Don.
slapped him around.
Yeah, I was going to say our single bullet guy, Arlen Specter.
But, and Perry was, just trying his best to hold on, you might say. But anyway, Perry said from the beginning that when he saw Oswald, that he looked like a dead man, and that he really felt that he was technically dead. Now, you have to understand something about dying, that when your organism dies, that not every part of you is instantly dead. It takes a while for every last cell to die, and for every last tissue and every last function to stop. You're still dead. You're already dead, but yet parts of you are still working. It's not unlike what happens to a chicken when, you cut off the head of a chicken and it can run around the yard for a while. Now, it is dead. It is totally dead. But yet, on a reflex level, it's still, certain tissues are still working, and its neuromuscles are still working, so it can still, and it's still metabolizing too. But, nevertheless, the organism is dead, but yet some tissues are still alive. Well, that's how really it was for Oswald. That's all. And it was also very much for Kennedy. you know, many of the doctors who worked on Oswald were also the doctors who worked on Kennedy, and they both said the same thing. They all said the same thing about both of them, that both of these men were already dead when they arrived at the operating room. And these were doctors, and they knew life, they knew death, and so the very idea that some doctor would have to take decisive action to kill Oswald when he was already dead is, you know, ridiculous, you know, on the face of it. But this is Dr. Tom Shires. He was the head of surgery at Parkland Hospital. Now, you know that Parkland Hospital was, and still is, the biggest hospital in Dallas. It was the major teaching hospital in the city of Dallas. And you know, well, you should know, you know that every big city has got a major teaching hospital. Like, for example, it's Cook County Hospital in Chicago.
Tulane University.
All right, in New Orleans?
Yeah,
and,
Tulane.
All right, and in Los Angeles, it's the USC. It's the hospital associated with USC that is the main teaching hospital. And the thing about these main teaching hospitals is not just that it's a place where teaching goes on and medical students get to learn, but it's also the hospital of last resort, meaning that if you have no insurance or no money, that there are other hospitals that may turn you away. But this main teaching hospital will take everybody. They will not turn you away for not having money or for insurance. And this was that hospital in Dallas. Now, Dr. Tom Shires was the head of surgery at Parkland Hospital. He was also a professor of surgery at Southwestern Medical School, which was the medical school associated with the University of Texas in Dallas. So he taught surgery. And he went on to have a very storied career. He lived all the way to 2007. And at the time of his death, he was actually still working. He was at that time associated with the teaching university at the University of Nevada in Las Vegas. But for a while after leaving Parkland, he was associated with a teaching university in New York City, in which he established the largest burn center in the city of New York, which is still the case today. He became the innovator of some surgical techniques that are still in use today. He was just a very successful, prominent, and storied surgeon. And he was the one who led the surgery on Lee Harvey Oswald. Now, the idea that, now, also, I want to tell everybody that it's very easy if you go online to YouTube, that if you just put in Dr. Tom Shires and Lee Harvey Oswald, it will take you to his press conference in which he talks about the surgery, the attempt to save Oswald's life. And basically what he says is that they transfused him, they tried to repair those blood vessels that were done, and for a while they got his blood pressure to start coming up. It was kind of looking like maybe it was going to be good. Now let me qualify that by saying that just because they got his blood pressure to start coming back doesn't necessarily mean that Oswald really had a chance, because it's possible he was already brain dead. I mean, Oswald, you know, his brain was, they said that from the very beginning, his eyes, his pupils were not responding to light. When you shine the light in the eyes, the pupil is supposed to contract in response to that focus of light. His eyes weren't doing that, so it's possible that Oswald really was already brain dead and none of it mattered. But at least temporarily, they started getting his blood pressure to start coming back. However, shortly after that, Oswald went into cardiac arrest. His heart just stopped. And they said that he had a flabby heart, meaning that there was no tone at all in the heart. And they started massaging the heart, and they started, you know, giving it electrical shocks, and they did everything they could, but there was nothing that was working, and eventually he was showing no signs of life at all, and they just called it quits and declared him dead. But anyway, he talks about it. You can hear him talking for about 10 or 12 minutes. And I'll tell you, I ask people to watch this, to go online and watch him, because if you're any kind of judge of character, I think you'll realize that Dr. Tom Shires was totally a straight shooter, totally a legit guy, totally a decent person. And the idea that he could have been involved in trying to kill Oswald, or the idea that some other doctor could have bamboozled him into killing Oswald without him knowing it, is just absolutely preposterous.
All the doctors at Parkland were straight up.
Oh, straight as
really
hell.
believe
And I really think it's extremely unfortunate that people have tried to drag Parkland doctors into the conspiracy.
Well, now, if they would have flown Oswald to Bethesda, you know,
That's
then,
different.
yeah, then maybe, yeah.
Right, okay. And by the way, Shires was also one of the doctors that did the work on Connolly. So, like I said, he was a straight shooter.
Yeah, whatever happened between the Dallas police station and arriving at Parkland. There's no doubt about it.
You know, let me just say this, Gary. You may be right. I really don't claim to know for sure, but I'm open to the possibility that they did it. They killed Oswald in the police station.
In fact, Ralph, do you remember the video where one of the reporters who said Lee Harold Oswald actually said on video that they have no idea where Lee Harvey Oswald is?
Right. Yes, exactly.
Now, that's very telling right there.
Right inside the police station. All right, let's go to the next image. We got another doctor to look at here.
Now, this guy's a straight shooter of all time.
Right. Now, this is Dr. McClellan, and this is him demonstrating the size and location of the blowout wound in the back of Kennedy's head. Now, this is a guy who's taken an awful lot of flack for this. Just yesterday, I watched the video that he did in 2013 for the 50th anniversary, in which another doctor interviewed him about his whole JFK experience. And he stuck to his guns and said, look, I was there and I'm telling you, you know, he had a big blowout wound in the back of his head. In fact, he described it in detail. He said that the entire, I remember his exact words. This is what he said in 2013. He said that the entire right cerebrum, the outer part of the brain, was missing. He said it was gone. And he said that he could see the cerebellum and that the cerebellum was oozing out of this opening and that a piece of it just fell off onto the table. Now, obviously, when you're seeing that, the man you're looking at is dead.
Dead.
I mean, dead as a doornail. I mean,
his brains roll over the trunk in the back seat of the car. I mean,
there was no chance of resuscitating or saving Kennedy. And the only reason they bothered giving him a tracheotomy was just because they thought that maybe he was uncomfortable struggling to breathe. That, you know, that maybe he was struggling and that they would just ease his breathing so that he could just die with a little bit more comfort. And that's the only reason they did that. But anyway, I'm showing you this image of him demonstrating this very conspiratorial thing of a big blowout wound in the back of the head to demonstrate that there isn't, you know, there isn't a snowball's chance in hell that he could have been involved in trying to kill Oswald or in letting anybody else kill Oswald in the operating room. So this is another guy who is absolutely above board. He's a hero, and a straight shooter, and somebody who's always been on the side of truth. And his name is Dr. Robert McClellan. I'll also point out that he was, at the time, a professor of medicine and surgery and went on to continue being a very, very esteemed professor of... and the reason why I keep emphasizing that is this, is, listen, the men who you know, really killed Kennedy, when you think about who they were, I mean, the ones that we most often cite, people like Allen Dulles and George H.W. Bush, these people were, you know, fanatical, you might say, political extremists, to use a term. But in other words, a doctor, a professor of medicine and surgery, I mean, even if he happened to be, say, a right-winger, even if he happened to be maybe somebody who didn't like Kennedy, the idea that in his position in life that he would get involved in killing somebody in the operating room just because somebody else wanted him to is just ridiculous on the face of it. It's just something he would never do. It wasn't his identity to do something like that. All right, go to the next image.
The doctors were important, but they needed to be reactionary. It all had to happen on the way to the hospital.
Okay. All right, now this is Dr. Ronald Jones. Dr. Jones was a young man at the time. He was considered a resident doctor at the time of the assassination, and he was the top resident doctor in Parkland Hospital. In other words, they rated their residents, meaning basically on how close you were, I guess, to being considered a real doctor, and he was considered the very top resident at Parkland Hospital, and he was included in this surgical team that operated on Oswald. There was a total of 4 operating surgeons. And then there was a 5th doctor who was the anesthesiologist, and I'm going to talk about him last. But Dr. Jones, okay, he was a resident at the time and not a professor, but he went on to become a professor. As far as I know, I think he's still alive, and he became a professor at Baylor University Medical School, and he became the whole head. He became basically the president, the head of Baylor University Medical School. And he also, like McClellan, was part of the team that operated on JFK. And like McClellan, he also said there was a big blowout wound in the back of the head. So if he was saying that about JFK, you might say in defiance of the official story that JFK didn't have such a wound, then why would he be killing Oswald a couple of days later for the sake of the conspirators? So it's preposterous to think that he would have been killing Oswald as well. So go to the next image.
Yeah, I love this image here.
Okay. Now, these are all the doctors who were demonstrating, and there were many more than this. This is just a few of doctors and nurses who demonstrated the location of the big blowout wound in the back of Kennedy's head. And the reason I put it up here is because on the lower left, it says Dr. Ronald Jones, and that's what he looked like. He was a young guy back then. And that was him demonstrating what he saw, a big opening, a big gory opening crevice, a big, like a canyon of an opening in the back of Kennedy's head, in which they could see his brain, his cerebellum.
Yeah, Dr. Paul Peters has done quite a few interviews. I really liked him a lot.
Right. And Carrico was another good one. Of course, there were many others, and also nurses who said the same thing. So there's no doubt that that's what existed on Kennedy.
Yeah, I think these 2 guys were the men who killed Kennedy.
Oh, they were.
Yeah.
But anyway, so now we've gone through 3 of the 4 doctors who operated, and there's no chance that any of them could have been killing Oswald. Here's the 4th one. You probably don't recognize him because this is taken late in life, but that is Dr. Malcolm Perry. That is the Dr. Perry,
really?
The one who said that JFK had an entrance wound in the front of his neck, not an exit wound. And it really is good to read his testimony because in it, he tries to be kind of nice, you might say, to Specter, saying that, well, all I'm saying is that from my experience, from having seen a lot of entrance wounds and a lot of exit wounds, that to me, it looked like an entrance wound, okay? I mean, you say what you want, but I'm just saying, this is my judgment. I'm a doctor, and this is what I'm telling you. But, frankly, I mean, if I had been, I would have been saying, fuck you, motherfucker. It's an entrance wound. Don't you try to tell me what it is. But that's just me. I'm a different personality than him. He was kind of nice. I wouldn't have been so nice to him. But anyway, this guy, and let me tell you something. This man, he really suffered. I never met him, but I got to know and interact with a friend of his, Dr. Donald Miller, who is a member of our group, the Oswald Innocence Campaign. And he is a heart doctor up at the University of Washington, Seattle. Again, another big teaching hospital. Also a professor of surgery at the medical school there. Dr. Miller is highly esteemed doctor.
So he suffered in
In
life.
other words, he got to be friends. You see, Malcolm Perry went up there and they worked together as colleagues for quite a while. And he got to know him as a colleague and also as a friend. And he and Dr. Perry, you know, expressed to him just the degree of strain that he suffered from all the JFK stuff and having to defend himself and all the pressure that was put on him to change his story and just what, you know, a toll that it took on him. But what he told him specifically was, he would say, Don, let me tell you, there isn't a shadow of a doubt that that was an entrance wound. I mean, they pressured me, but the fact is there's no doubt. It really absolutely was an entrance wound. And I'll tell you something else, that Dr. Miller, who put that story on his blog, he didn't just tell it to me. He told it to me, but he also put it on his blog. He did not put it on his blog until after Dr. Perry died. He waited until Dr. Perry died, and then he put it on there that he was absolutely certain that it was an entrance wound in his neck. Anyway, he had a very storied career. He also taught at the Texas Tech University Medical School in Lubbock. He also taught at the University of Nevada and their medical school. So he traveled around the country, was very highly revered, a great doctor, and the chance that he would have done anything to hurt Oswald is absolutely preposterous. So now we've gone through all four of the doctors who were operating on Oswald, and there really isn't any chance that any one of them would have done anything like that.
You know, you can almost see it in his eyes that he's been through a lot.
Right, you can see it in his eyes. But the other thing is this: is doctors, when you spend your whole life basically trying to save people, the idea, I mean, it just goes so completely against the grain to do otherwise. They wouldn't have done it under any conditions. But anyway, this is the last guy, and his name is Jenkins. Marion Thomas Jenkins was his name. And he was actually the head doctor he was considered the head doctor at the rescue team of operating on JFK. He was in there in the room with the others operating on JFK. He was the chief of anesthesiology at Parkland Hospital, and he had been since 1948. Can you imagine? He was the head anesthesiologist at that hospital from 1948 then to 1963. And he had been a professor of anesthesiology at Southwestern Medical School from 1951. So for already for 12 years, he had been a professor of anesthesiology. He went on to develop a special technique of anesthesiology that is still in use today all over the world. He also eventually taught at a prestigious university in New York. His daughter went on to make a kind of like a documentary film about his life and about his involvement in the JFK case and operating on Oswald and on Kennedy. And like I said, he administered the anesthesia to Oswald, but the chance that he could have done something to try to kill Oswald, and these other four doctors who were right there looking down on the body under bright lights wouldn't have noticed it, is absolutely preposterous.
Yeah.
So back to David Lifton, like I said, in this program he did, Night Fry. What's the name of the guy who's the host of Night Fry? Do you remember his name? I forget his name, but he's written a book on the JFK assassination himself. But he asked him, he says, all right, for goodness sake, tell us the name of the doctor you think killed Oswald. And Lifton said, no, I'm not going to tell you. You're going to have to read the book. It's going to be in the book. And I'm going to name this doctor who did it. But this is, by the way, I'm pretty sure this is just his assumption. I don't think the pathologist who's the first to propose the idea that a Parkland doctor killed Oswald, I don't know that he actually named a doctor. I just think he assumed that a doctor did it. But Lifton claims to know which doctor did it. But it really is preposterous. What Gary said is true. The Parkland doctors, they were all completely innocent. None of them had anything to do with it.
Hey, Don, is it safe to say that the Parkland doctors were not trying to take over the country for the greater good?
Yeah, I don't see any evidence that the Parkland doctors.
Well, and here's another thing to think about is this.
Yeah.
This was a conspiracy. And, granted, there were quite a few people who know about it. But the whole idea of a conspiracy is that you don't tell everybody. And, if they were recruiting, doctors at Parkland Hospital to be part of it, all of whom had, families, friends, children, etc. What hope was there to keep this conspiracy under a lid?
Well, look, if the Parkland doctors are all going back here with the wound, they're obviously not in on the operation.
Yeah, there's a big difference between the Dallas doctors and the Dallas police now.
Oh, yeah, there's no question about that.
No, there were some, I agree with, that, there were definitely, Dallas police involved. But I think that many of them.
Not all.
Not all, definitely not all. No, like for example,
Curry. Do you think Curry was involved? I really don't.
I do. He had to be.
The example I was going to give is Marion Baker. I do not think that Marion Baker was involved. I do not. I think he was a straight shooter. I don't. He was a lowly motorcycle cop. I don't think that anybody tapped him on the shoulder and said, "Hey, we're going to kill Kennedy on Friday. Are you aware of that?" No. He wasn't in on it, but Roscoe.
So it would mean that Oswald walked right inside right away.
Well, here's the thing here's what I want you to consider. I think very few were actually involved in advance. Like, for example, take Will Fritz. Will Fritz was sitting in the Trade Mart at a table waiting to eat a steak with JFK. Now, if he knew that JFK was going to have his brain blown out in Dealey Plaza, he would have been in Dealey Plaza to see that. The fact that he went to the Trade Mart tells me that he didn't know that JFK was going to be killed.
He was more than willing to participate after the fact.
But after the fact. Now, I do believe that Fritz was very much involved in the shooting of Oswald. I think that the way he marched out there in that procession, he knew very well what was going to happen. The fact that he didn't turn around right away after a gun blast goes off. It's a very loud noise, I've got a 38.
It's going to scare the daylights out of you because it might be aimed at you.
Right. So the fact that he didn't turn around. I think that, and I really believe, and I want to say this again, that I really think that the decision that Oswald had to die went to the top, meaning to Lyndon Johnson and J. Edgar Hoover, that they're the ones who basically passed it down, that for the sake of the country, to get closure, to basically prevent the kind of turmoil that would otherwise come from a trial, that we just have to take the action in advance of what a jury would surely do, and that is, condemn this man to death. And I think that the willingness of the Dallas police to get involved in killing Oswald was based partly on that and partly on the fact that they believed that he killed Tippit. And the cop killer had to die, that kind of thing. But anyway, I feel very bad that David Lifton is doing this now. Because, I have the feeling that he's sort of at the end of a long career. He's devoted all these decades to the JFK assassination, and I think he wants to go out, with a bang. And so he's coming out with this new thing, but it is not well-founded. And I'm curious to know what doctor he's going to finger as being the one who killed Oswald. But it's ridiculous on so many levels, including the level of the simple fact that Oswald was already dead. For all practical purposes, Oswald was like a chicken with his head cut off. They were never going to save him. These doctors know it. Even if one of them was desired for Oswald to die and wished for him to succumb, he would have realized that nature was going to take its course, and there was no need for him to risk doing something that his colleagues, his very bright, very competent colleagues, were certain to observe and to catch him doing. So no, there's really no chance that any of this happened. And I really do regret that David Lifton has decided to take this course of action. But hopefully I've nipped it in the bud. And
okay, well, if you don't mind, can I play the one that needs to know? All right, David Lifton has written a new book, you're saying?
Yes.
And he's saying that one of the Dallas doctors was involved in killing Oswald.
Yes, that's what he is claiming. That he, in fact,
Moonrock Books. We're a group of scholars, experts, and authors who feel the world really needs saving, and that resisting the American empire is the right thing to do. People are starved for truth. They are given lies. They subsist on lies, but it's not really living. People are not watching TV news. They're ceasing to read newspapers too, because they know by now they will not find it there. The biggest battle being fought anywhere is with information. If the people can receive the truth, they will do the right thing. We are publishing the truth about Sandy Hook, about the Boston bombing, about the moon landings, about the Holocaust, and much, much more. The truth. It falls upon us to fight the empire and save the world. Join us, Moonrock Books.
Coup d'etat in slow motion, connecting the dots between the assassinations of Swedish Prime Minister Olof Palme, JFK, Robert Kennedy, and John Lennon. Now available on Amazon and lightonconspiracies.com. Coup d'etat in slow motion.